giving folks time to log on. Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. I am Denise Solzbach, Director of the National Center at the Institute for Innovation and Implementation at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and I'm also the Deputy Director of the TA Network. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation in our series, Managing Now for a Better Tomorrow, Addressing Equity During COVID-19. We first began these conversations back in March when COVID was new to us, and we were focused on how to manage to the immediate challenges in our work. This fall, we are refocusing the series on the Better Tomorrow part of the title, with forward-looking solutions to help us all create a brighter future for the youth and families that we serve. What remains consistent in our conversations is the opportunity for peer-to-peer learning, for you to talk with the presenters as well as one another. And we can see by the chat box action here that you're very good at that. Keep it coming. Please continue to use the chat box to share your thoughts, resources, and questions throughout today's discussion. In follow-up, we will send everyone who registered a link to the recordings as well as to resources and insights shared in the chat box. Today's discussion is being recorded and is also being live streamed to our YouTube channel. Participant audio will be muted for today's discussion. If you are joining us today through Zoom, you are welcome to submit the questions, comments, and resources you're doing now in the chat box. To make sure that both the presenters and the participants can see your comments, questions, and contributions, please make sure you go to the To field for the chat box, click on the drop-down menu, and make sure to select all panelists and all attendees. You'll see there's an all panelist option as well as all panelists and attendees. So please make sure that you select the second option. If you are joining us via YouTube live stream, please post your comments, questions, and resources in the comments sections. If you have any problems with technology, please use the chat box to communicate with the panelists, and our tech team, Sarah and Gary, will jump in to help you. And I'm also seeing, yes, you will receive in follow-up to your this discussion today in your email, you will receive information on how to obtain a certificate of participation. I also want to let you know that while we are recording today, your comments or questions may be otherwise recognized by the panelists. So while you will be muted for today's discussion, we could be reading your comments to the panelists or to everyone who's participating. Maryland law requires us to tell you that this discussion will be recorded. Your participation via the chat implies your consent. Again, we truly value and appreciate your contributions in the chat as they are used to guide our dialogue. Also, if you are deaf or hard of hearing, we have ASL interpreters joining us today. We have Morgan Beal and Melanie Schlang. They are designated as such in their video feed. You'll see their names and designation as ASL interpreters. You can pin the video for the ASL interpreters so that their video feeds are prominent and always show for you. To pin them, hover over the video of the ASL interpreter and click the 3 dots. From the menu, select Pin, and then repeat for the other ASL interpreter so that you're able to see both of them as they alternate throughout the discussion. At the end of today's discussion, an evaluation will pop up for you to complete. We ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation as your feedback does help us make the series better and more responsive to your needs. We will be tweeting throughout today's discussion. If you would like to join us, please use the hashtags BetterTomorrow and TA Network Talks and tag us at Institute UMSSW and NCSMH Tweets, and that stands for the National Center for School Mental Health. Sarah, can you please bring up the next slide? To view our prior recordings and/or sign up for upcoming discussions, please go to the institute.umaryland.edu/COVID-19. Next slide, please, Sarah. And today's discussion is on school mental health and supporting students, families, and educators as school restarts during COVID-19. Next slide. Our moderator today is our colleague and friend, Dr. Sharon Hoover. Many of you have worked with and know Sharon in her role as the co-director of the National Center for School Mental Health. Sharon is a licensed clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and is also now the director of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network Center for Safe Supportive Schools. Sharon, thanks again for joining us today and leading today's discussion. Joining us today as well is Dr. Tiffany Beeson. She is also with the National Center for School Mental Health and an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Dr. Beeson is trained as a generalist with specialized training in providing trauma-informed treatment in schools that serve primarily low-income youth and families of color. Thanks for joining us as well, Tiffany. Also joining us is Dr. Christopher Balanci. Christopher is the Vice President of Policy and Practice and the Chief Medical Officer at the Judge Baker Children's Center at Harvard. He is board certified child and adolescent as well as adult psychiatrist, and he served as the TA Network's medical director since our inception. Thanks again for joining us, Christopher. Finally, Shauna Rader Kelly is a full-time school psychologist in Bozeman, Montana, where she serves as the school psychologist at Bozeman High School. Shauna was also named by the National Association of School Psychologists as the 2017 School Psychologist of the Year. Welcome to all of you, and thank you again for joining us today. Sharon, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much, Shanice, and thank you to the Institute and the School of Social Work for welcoming our team here today with all of you. I am delighted to facilitate today's conversation. And as Denise said, our goal really is to engage all of you in a conversation about school mental health and specifically about supporting students and families and educators as schools restart amidst COVID-19. And I am heartened, I want to say, by seeing so many of you from across the nation already introducing yourselves and even sharing resources. Keep it up. We want to see active communication through the chat box. This really is intended to be a conversation across all of you and not just from us to you. We want there to be good peer learning here. We anticipate today hearing about issues of education and behavioral health equity, ideas for promoting the mental health and well-being of students and families and educators. We anticipate hearing about stress, including traumatic stress, and also hopefully innovations that will support students in person and also via distance technology. And really, no matter the learning landscape that you are facing, whether it's in person or hybrid or fully virtual, our goal today is to learn about specific experiences from the field and to brainstorm solutions and innovations with all of you and with peers from across the country. So just very quickly, a little about myself, and then I'll be turning it over to my panelist colleagues to say a few words about themselves. Again, I'm Sharon Hoover, and I co-direct our National Center for School Mental Health, which is based at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And our center is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and specifically the Health Resources and Services Administration. And our mission is to support schools and districts and states as they implement school mental health systems. And we're currently leading National Learning Collaborative to improve school mental health. So we're working with state behavioral health and education leaders, and they're partnering school districts to install and sustain multi-tiered systems of behavioral health supports. We also serve as a community behavioral health provider right here in Maryland, and we serve schools in Baltimore City and Prince George's County and Baltimore County, offering a full continuum of behavioral health supports to students and families. And Dr. Beeson provides services in one of our schools and tremendous support to our program, and you'll be hearing from her as well today. As with all of us, our work to support schools and educators and students and families has shifted dramatically in the context of COVID. And as a national center, we've been responding to requests from the field, ranging from how do we support all students, including providing educators and families with tools to foster stability, social emotional health, well-being, and also how do we quickly transition to provide behavioral health supports remotely or via distance technology. So I'm eager to learn from all of you to help inform our work. We do have a website, schoolmentalhealth.org, I think was shared in the chat box, with a page dedicated specifically to a repository of resources on COVID-19 for students, families, educators, and school mental health professionals. And I know that we'll continue to share some of those resources as we go on today. But I'd like to now invite each of our panelists just to share a minute or so about themselves, including how their current work is being impacted by the current national context, including our experience of this global pandemic. So let me first ask Dr. Tiffany Beeson to introduce herself.
Good afternoon again, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Beeson, and I am an assistant professor within the University of Maryland Division of Child and Adolescent Psychology in the National Center for School Mental Health. And in my role, I work as a school-based mental health clinician within a West Baltimore City school. And I provide a full continuum of supports. I provide therapeutic supports to students with emotional and behavioral difficulties, as well as lead a number of mental health prevention and promotion services and supports to students and staff. And due to COVID and school closures, I have been providing all of those supports virtually. And in addition to my work as a clinician, I work within the National Center, primarily on training and technical assistance projects and initiatives. Currently, I am working on the development of a national training curriculum for educators and school mental health clinicians on meeting the mental health needs of students through the use of cultural responsiveness and equity practices. I'm also the cultural responsiveness and equity lead within the National Center for Safe Supportive Schools, where we are fostering safe and supportive schools through the use of culturally responsive, trauma-informed, comprehensive school mental health.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And now I'll invite Dr. Christopher Valanci to say a few words.
Hi, it's so good to be with all of you today. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I have consulted to schools throughout my career. At Judge Baker, I'm the Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Policy and Practice, and we also, as one of our direct services, run a therapeutic school for children starting as young as kindergarten up to the 10th grade, serving children from public schools in the Eastern Massachusetts area. I think we serve over 50 districts at this point and have a capacity of 120 students. And we just started last week in a hybrid format. So we have half the students in at 1 week and then half the students in the rest of the week. And have been consulting to public and private schools throughout my career, and pretty riveted on their incredible adaptation and resilience in the face of this pandemic, coming up with some very creative solutions in continuing to meet the behavioral health needs of all their students, but particularly those in tiers 2 and 3, if we're thinking about an MTSS model.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And now I'll invite Shauna Rader-Kelly to say hello.
Hi, thank you for having me today. My name is Shauna Rader-Kelly. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist for the Bozeman Public School District in Bozeman, Montana, currently serving the students at Bozeman High School, where our students are back participating in either remote learning or a hybrid learning model, where they're participating in the classroom 2 days a week and participating remotely for the other 3. I'm passionate about serving the profession of school psychology. I'm active in both state and national volunteer leadership, and I'm currently serving on the board of directors for the National Association of School Psychologists as the strategic liaison for professional advocacy. I'm also a mom to an amazing third grader who's very happy to be back in school with her teachers and with her classmates. She is currently attending 5 days a week, and she is really glad to see me back working as a school psychologist and happy that my short stint as an online learning facilitator is over.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and thanks to all of our panelists today. I know that you will share your wisdom and your experiences to the benefit of all of our participants today. So thank you for being here with us. And as a mom of 3 teens doing distance learning right now, I certainly can relate to your experiences, Shauna, as a working from home and trying to teach from home experience. It's new territory for all of us. So today we want to hear from all of you about both the challenges that you're experiencing during this complex time, but also the successful strategies that you've employed to support students and families and educators. We have found that people are somewhat saturated with webinars and resources. So this conversational approach really is intended to foster more of a peer-to-peer learning and support opportunity. We encourage you, as I mentioned, to enter your questions, your comments, your responses through the chat feature. I'll point one out right now. We heard from Catherine Homer, who shared a resource on secondary traumatic stress. And I want to highlight this. I'm familiar with this resource, the STAT program. And given that we know the tremendous amount of stress that our educators are under, this is a resource that came out of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and specifically out of the Treatment Services and Adaptation Center for Hope, Resiliency, Hope, and Wellness in Schools. And they developed this free online training, which supports educators who may be experiencing secondary traumatic stress. And we know many are coping with the stressors that their students and families are bringing to them. So today we do have some questions to get the conversation going, but we are relying on you, our participants today, to ask and answer the questions, as well as our panelists. So we may follow a general flow. We're first probably going to talk about the demands on schools and educators right now and how we can support their well-being during this time. And then we'll probably move towards a discussion on how we can best support students and families in supporting student mental health. But we'll see where the chat takes us, and we encourage you to guide the conversation with us. So as I mentioned, we'll go ahead and start with a discussion of the demands on educators and our teachers and how we can best support their well-being. So I first want to pose a question to the audience and ask you to respond in the chat box, and then I'll turn to our panelists. So for our audience, for all of our participants today, what are the most prominent concerns that you are hearing from educators right now? And then while we're seeing the responses come up in our chat box, I'm going to go ahead and turn to Shauna and ask, what are the most prominent concerns that you're hearing about as a frontline school psychologist and someone who has their pulse on the national field of school psychology? What are the most prominent concerns you're hearing about from educators right now in your school or district or across the nation?
Sure. Thanks, Sharon. Well, first and foremost, educators are concerned about their students, just like they have been since this began in March. And I think we're only seeing that increase as our students are re-entering the building and they're reacquainting themselves with their teachers. I think educators recognize that the school closures resulted in a ripple effect for students, for staff, for our families, and also for our broader community. In my conversations with educators, I find that they're focused not only on the implications for the academic development of their students, but also for children's social and emotional well-being, on the increased stress that they see that's placed on families and caregivers, and on the mental and physical health of their students. Educators are also acutely aware that the pandemic and the resulting school closures and the remote and hybrid learning models that we find ourselves in are serving only to exacerbate an achievement gap that we know exists and have been working very hard to address, particularly for students from historically minoritized backgrounds and for our students with disabilities. I know educators are working to address this, but we all know that the pandemic is not impacting everyone in the same way. And I think what I'm hearing is concerns for our students who may be adversely impacted by these closures and the pandemic sort of writ large. Right now, our educators are learning to navigate remote learning and hybrid learning models, new curriculum, new online learning platforms, but also those new health and safety protocols that are designed to make our school buildings and activities safer for all of the participants, but really represent a new way of just doing our jobs. And in the midst of this, I think we'd be remiss to say that if we don't talk about the fact that educators are also worried about their own health and the health of their loved ones and also the well-being of their families. Many of them are in the position of not only caring for their children, but carrying on with their work and in many ways just learning a new way to do their job. And I have so much empathy for that as someone who's navigated working from home and finding new ways to do my job in terms of delivering more telehealth related services and finding new ways to support the administrators and the staff that I work with. So I fully understand where they're coming from, both as educators and also as working parents. And so I think almost all educators would agree that we want to be back in schools. We want to be working with our students. Most of us went into these fields so that we could walk the halls and interact with kids every day. But we want to do so in a manner that's safe, both for the staff and for our kids and for their families.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Such a great response. Really so many facets to this. And I have to say, I'm overwhelmed, but again, really heartened and excited to see such a response in the chat box. And many of the themes that you touched on, Shauna, have been echoed and shared by our participants. I've seen the word overwhelmed pop up here about 20 or 30 times. Other concerns that came up included safety concerns, fear of exposure, fear of them not receiving adequate safety measures to keep them healthy and safe in school. A number of you mentioned that educators are really concerned about those hard to reach students and families. We're certainly hearing that a lot. I saw the term virtual fatigue come up a couple of times, really struggling to not only navigate this new learning environment, but also struggling to engage students. The number of times I've heard through my own teens' cameras, please turn the cameras on, you know, it's a struggle, and just engaging students who are not able to access the learning environment. Concerns about academic development, you mentioned. A number of our participants today mentioned the worsening of the opportunity gaps for our students, whether it be through limited internet access or opportunity to access the learning environment altogether. Some of you mentioned that educators are navigating having to teach their students in their class, but also their own children, and trying to do double or triple duty. We've seen a number of concerns here highlighted by our participants around inequities. And aligned with that theme, I want to ask Tiffany, I want to comment first. We know that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting communities of color, in part related to disparities in access to equitable quality healthcare. But we also know that communities of color will be disproportionately impacted by school closures and learning impacts. And so I want to ask you, what are some COVID-19 equity related concerns for educators?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And, you know, we know that prior to COVID, that many families with limited income experience financial hardships, and COVID has just exacerbated these problems. And in particular, people of color have been disproportionately impacted. A recent study found that Black and Latinx parents are more likely to have lost their jobs as a result of COVID. And so families are experiencing not just problems with, you know, accessing the material goods that they need to have their child engage in distance or hybrid learning, like access to internet and technology, but they're also struggling to meet their family's basic needs because of financial hardships. So having difficulties with food and housing stability. I know many folks brought those up in the comments. And we know that when children are hungry, they have problems with focusing in the classroom, and they experience difficulties with emotional and behavioral regulation in the classroom. And teachers are seeing this firsthand. Also, Black and Latinx families are more likely to work at jobs where they have to go into the office and they can't work from home. And so what this means is that many families are experiencing childcare issues. And for our teenagers and even for some elementary and middle school age children who are participating in distance learning or a hybrid model and trying to navigate that new learning environment for themselves, they may also be responsible for taking care of their younger siblings and helping their younger siblings navigate distance learning or a hybrid learning environment. And that can really be a barrier for their own educational growth and development. Also, unfortunately, because of the financial hardships that families are experiencing, there are some teenagers who are having to take on the responsibility to get work, to help feed their families. Again, another barrier that teachers and educators, administrators are seeing across the nation.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And, we continue to see our participants chiming in with other ways that COVID is impacting their educators as well as their students and families, including some of these disproportional impacts on communities of color. So please continue the dialogue in the chat box. And a few questions have come in about how do we address some of these educator concerns, including tech fatigue and concerns about engaging students. So we're going to move to that in a couple of moments. But first, I want to ask Christopher just to speak to some of the stress and even traumatic stress that we know our teachers may be experiencing. We saw the resource come into the chat box about secondary traumatic stress for teachers. We know that our educators are going to be working with many students and families directly impacted by COVID. So talk to us about why educators are especially at risk for secondary traumatic stress and maybe some things that we can be doing to support our educators.
Sure, and thank you. This is Christopher. When this all started happening in late winter, early spring in Massachusetts, I'm vividly recalling it was Friday the 13th of March. And the day that I started out was not the day that I ended with in terms of my expectations of what was going to happen. And our governor declared a state of emergency and pretty much everything shut down. And I thought, fine, I'll hunker down for 2 weeks and then this will blow over and then we'll be through this and life will return to the way it was. And here we are 6 months later. And so I think part of managing anxiety and managing stress like this, it's helpful when you know what you're getting through, and what's the end point. And this is a pandemic that has no apparent end in sight. And we just continue to have not just the pandemic of the virus, but we also have a pandemic of structural racism. And we have these other natural disasters that are happening. So parts of the country that are facing hurricanes, fires that are happening on the West Coast that are actually causing climate change and impacts all the way on the East Coast. There were a couple of days that the sky was very hazy all the way in Massachusetts. There was an earthquake recently in LA. And then there's all of the political upheaval that we're also finding completely draining of our resources and our energy at a time when we need to be able to harness those resources most. And the other issue that I think is very unique in this particular challenge is that it's not just happening to others, it's happening to all of us at the same time. Differentially, absolutely, often associated with race and class and access issues, but it's something that is impacting all of us. And so you're not just managing your own personal response to the crisis, as well as managing your family's response to the crisis, as well as then being asked to step into a professional role and being a leader and being often a frontline mandated essential worker, which isn't necessarily the jobs that many educators signed up to do. Who thought that by being an educator, you were going to be asked to in many ways put your lives at risk by showing up for work. And so having a whole new set of expectations, and then being concerned and caring for others, and modeling, trying to model for your students how to manage that anxiety and that stress. So, in the early phases of this, I was hearing a lot about anxiety and even traumatic reactions. And now 6 months in, I'm starting to hear more about depression and despair. And I think that's reflective of people's resources being really tapped out at this point. Just at a time when we're starting the new school year, at a time when you would be hopeful that you can really harness whatever breaks you may have been able to get over the summer and be prepared for a new academic year. So I think it's unprecedented in terms of what we're asking of people. And I think we need to acknowledge that and name that, because I think part of what hopefully we're able to provide in these kinds of forums are opportunities to validate each other, that this is an incredibly difficult and challenging time, and then draw up upon our natural sources of resilience and try to figure out, so what are some creative solutions to all of these challenges? Because I fear that if we just focus on the challenges, people will leave here even more depleted than they started before this call. And so I want to make sure that we're also thinking about solutions and the incredible resilience that I have seen evidenced in so many school systems and school staff.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you for pointing us in the direction of solutions, because while we know it's healing, it can be healing to really have shared validation of our collective trauma and stress and grief. It is also important to be solution oriented to the extent that we can be. So in that vein, I'm going to ask a few questions of our audience and our panelists that really speak to some solutions. In fact, one of the questions came from the audience. How can we help lessen the tech fatigue? So there's lots of ways we're experiencing fatigue, and we will get to some of those, but let's talk about that tech fatigue. Some people call it Zoom fatigue. Some people call it, distance learning fatigue. The educators are experiencing fatigue. Our students may be experiencing fatigue. A lot of families are expressing concern about students staring at a screen all day on top of what they may have already been doing. So I would love to hear from our participants about some innovative, creative ways that you have seen families, educators, students come up with to cope with that Zoom fatigue or that tech fatigue. One of our folks called it being a Zoombie. So hopefully I'll see some ideas pop up here. But Shauna, I'm curious if you've seen any creative strategies for educators or students or families to help with that tech fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly amazed at how creative teachers and parents can be in terms of taking a lesson that is designed maybe for an in-person instructional environment that's been adapted to an online learning platform that yet still manages to engage a child in some activity. I saw some great things in our community last spring where kids were learning about history by doing sort of virtual tours or actual tours, if they were able to do it, of the city and exploring some things. I've seen some scavenger hunts that teachers have put together. And so I think any of those activities that can be somehow introduced in a virtual format, but that somehow engage a child in their broader community in creative ways are really helpful. And then I also think that if we can create a virtual experience where kids are able to connect with one another, I am constantly hearing from kids that what they really miss, what it comes down to, is that they miss relationship. And so if we can create the opportunity for relationship and team building in those activities, I think that that's wonderful. I've seen some amazing things from school counselors who are delivering social emotional learning and guidance curriculum online that help to continue to foster that relationship building. Health enhancement teachers are continuing to amaze me in terms of how they're teaching some of those self-care and health skills virtually. But at the end of the day, what they're really coming back to is they're establishing relationship with kids and with adults. And I think that those are great techniques too.
Great, thanks so much. And we're seeing some awesome creative ideas in the chat box. I'm seeing things like going on walks outside while doing teletherapy. So you're getting maybe the boost of the therapy while also walking outside. Music before and after your learning sessions, taking multiple brain breaks. We know a lot of educators are employing those. Virtual parent and parent-child groups, neighborhood social distance lunch groups, Wellness Wednesdays, online PE coaching. I saw one of our participants mentioned Latin dance demonstration that they've had in some of their classes, breaking things down into small segments. So really fantastic ideas. Keep them coming. I can guarantee that people will be stealing shamelessly and sharing seamlessly is what we talk about often. And so we hope that you're doing that today. So before we move to student mental health specifically, I want to stay on this theme of educator well-being. And I'd love to hear in the chat box and from our panelists, what are the best resources and strategies you have seen to support educator self-care and well-being? And I want to nuance the question a little bit by asking not just about self-care, but also things that organizations, whether it's the district or the school administration, can do to support educator well-being, right? We don't want to put the onus all on the educator just to take better care of themselves. So both, what are some educator self-care strategies that you've seen effective right now? And what are some organizational strategies to support educator well-being? Tiffany, I'm going to point that question to you to see if you've seen anything in your school or through your work at the National Center.
Yeah, I've been super encouraged by school administrators just having a really good awareness of how stressed teachers are and really showing commitment to supporting teachers with taking care of themselves and not just promoting self-care, but also providing a structure so teachers can engage in self-care, right? And so across districts, we are seeing districts offering regular self-care professional development exercises and trainings. And as a school mental health clinician, I have been engaged in providing some of those supports, as well as providing additional supports through wellness resources like newsletters on various health and wellness topics that have clickable links, that staff can go to very quickly, click on a link and practice an activity that's available for free. Also in partnership with schools, I have been supporting with providing open forums for teachers to really provide them some space, a non-evaluative space where they can get necessary social support from each other and really discuss the needs and challenges that are coming up for them and hear from each other about what they're doing to take care of themselves and provide, some, support with their own personal coping and problem solving around issues related to doing the work with kids and managing all of the impacts of COVID on their personal lives. And I've also been really impressed by a new co-teacher peer support model that my school is using, where teachers are essentially partnered up with each other. And the goal is to promote bonding and a sense of community across teachers and with teachers, but also so that each teacher has a go-to person that they can go to get additional supports around lesson planning, troubleshooting tech difficulties, and just general social emotional support. Another thing that schools are implementing are whole staff social emotional learning activities. So schools are doing things like socially distanced nature activities for staff. And again, that really does allow staff to build up a sense of community and provide a space for relationships to build and for them to be active, physically active in a safe way and enjoy the outdoors.
Great ideas, Tiffany. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you're observing these things in your schools and beyond. And we saw some of those themes again echoed from our participants, things like second step adult social emotional learning modules, We've seen the CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, come out with many more resources now on adult social emotional competencies. So that's a great go-to resource. One of the participants mentioned that they're doing second step adult SEL modules in their school. We saw a number of participants mention specific strategies for teachers, including mindfulness and yoga. Multi-tiered systems of support for educators is something that we've heard as well. Oftentimes we think about these supports being for students, but many of our administrators said that over the summer they were developing multi-tiered systems to really assess and address any concerns that their educators, their teachers were presenting with. Someone asked a question in the chat, any creative play ideas for staff? So if anybody has those, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. Are there any ways that our educators can actually use play as a form of healing? I love the idea of the co-teacher peer support model. It's similar to something that we've seen called tap in, tap out, where educators are given a structure where they can essentially tap out when they need respite from their classroom. That's another resource, hopefully, that folks can look up. And virtual comm rooms is something that we saw come up a few times in the chat. So really wonderful strategies and ideas here. So keep the ideas coming. We want to move to a conversation about the mental health of our students and families, as well as our educators. And we know that all of those are inextricably linked, but we know that for students and families, this is an uncharted educational landscape. And again, whether our students are returning in person or hybrid or from distance, most have had a significant disruption in their education experience. And schools are working on not only creating a welcoming environment for all students, no matter the format of the education, but also to identify and support students who may be exhibiting mental health concerns. And so we want to start talking about what can schools do, what are schools doing, what can they do, both to create these mental health promoting atmospheres as we restart school, but also to support students who may be struggling, to identify and support students who may be struggling. Before we move to that, I do want to remind everyone that we have ASL interpreters here to support our deaf or hard of hearing. And if you would like to see those individuals on your screen, they are Melanie Schlang and Morgan Beal, and you just go ahead and pin them by clicking the 3 dots in the upper right corner of their video screen. Okay. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead, before I ask our panelists a few questions about student and family mental health, I want to ask our participants, our audience, what strategies are you seeing schools use to welcome students back, to support their transition, and to foster mental health and well-being of all students as we restart school? So we're going to start from kind of what are we doing for all students, and then we'll move to what about students who may be experiencing specific challenges. So what strategies are you seeing schools use to welcome students back and help them with this transition in a way that is mental health promoting? And I'm going to go ahead and ask Shauna that same question. What strategies are you seeing schools use to welcome students back, support their transition, and promote their mental health for all students?
Yeah, Sharon, this is an excellent question. I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was that emphasis on relationship. And I think this goes back to that transition back to school. For many of our students, they have been away from school for 6 months, but they have also been away from peers and that community for 6 months. And so ensuring that there is opportunity to either establish or reestablish those relationships with the school community in whatever format they're accessing it is incredibly important. As educators, I mean, we're certainly excited to get back to academics and to the instruction, but we have to understand that ensuring that student mental health needs are met and that those relationships are established, that has to be of paramount importance. And our students are not going to be able to learn if they don't have that. So I'm seeing a lot of emphasis on that. I think one of the things that's particularly important for those of us who are going back to school, to a school building in some sense, is to be sure that we're navigating both psychological safety and physical safety. So for many students, when they're re-entering the school building, it's going to look and feel very different to them. We're wearing masks when we're in buildings together. There may be fewer people on the bus. They may not be in classes with their peers or with a much smaller group of students. So those of you who have walked through a school building, you know that they look and feel different this year. And we want to communicate to students that they are physically safe and that all of these measures are there to ensure that they're physically safe. But we also want to think about that psychological safety too. So helping them to feel psychologically safe in the building. They have to understand and feel that the school is a safe place for them to be. For many of our kids, school has historically been the place that's been safe for them. And so Chris mentioned earlier, all of the other things that are happening in our country right now are also impacting students' sense of both physical and psychological safety as well. And so I think we have to work very hard at this point in time to ensure that kids feel safe, that they feel welcomed, and that they feel part of that learning community. And so I think that's of paramount importance. I think the same is true for kids that are accessing in a hybrid or remote model. The relationship continues to be important, and we have to find ways to connect those kids with peers and the adults that they will be working with. So I think that it just goes back to that relationship and really establishing that within that multi-tiered system of supports and utilizing those good positive behavioral intervention strategies that we've become so accustomed to in schools.
Thanks so much, Shauna. Great ideas. And again, I'm astounded by the creative ideas that our participants are sharing. We've seen things like social emotional classes every single day, drive-through back to school nights. I saw a lot of drive-through ideas, drive-through supplies, drive-through swag bags for students, drive-through getting supplies. Shortening the curriculum we saw as a recommendation. A few of our community partners in the chat box have mentioned that they are working with schools to provide virtual therapy sessions. So this really is an opportune time to reach out to your community behavioral health partners, many of whom have seen a decrease in their provision of services, and it might be an opportunity for schools to actually partner and do some virtual work. I saw a respondent say 3 outside tents for outside learning when possible, virtual walking Wednesdays. One of the comments that you made, Shauna, in terms of schools being a safe place for many students, really tied to one of the comments from Catherine, one of our participants earlier in the chat, who said, we support, or let me start here. I've been working in the home visiting since 2014. And the complexities of today's politics, racial justice, et cetera, it all seems to highlight the safe spaces that schools were able to provide. And we know this, we hear this daily now. So how can we make safe spaces at home like we have done so successfully in school and community settings? And I thought that just really emphasized the point that we not only need to be recognizing schools as a place that is essential for mental health, but also empowering our families and our homes as places for students to be safe. One of our comments in this last question from a participant said that they're doing parent coaching, that we first need to empower parents. One of the creative strategies I saw in the chat box, seemingly simple, but maybe really important in terms of our relationships. It came from a teacher saying that their badges, they have pictures of their faces so that they can see them both with a mask and without a mask. Again, those are the strategies we want to hear about, because while simple, in theory, it may not be something that others have thought of or used, and it can make a world of difference in our students' lives. So really important. So thank you for those great ideas in terms of mental health promotion and welcoming all of our students back. Let's go ahead and talk about students who may be experiencing mental health challenges. One of the questions that came in the chat box from Aaron, from Alyssa, has anyone seen an increase in youth substance use during this time? And we've seen in the earlier chat, people recognizing that students are in fact likely to be experiencing not only more substance use issues, but other mental health concerns, whether it be anxiety, depression, trauma, grief. And so I want to ask all of you, the participants, what are the most prominent mental health current concerns that you're hearing about from families and students? So the most prominent mental health concerns you're hearing about. And then I'm going to turn to Christopher and ask, what mental health concerns should we be anticipating? What mental health concerns are we seeing in our student population?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we were already starting to see increases in adolescent suicide rates even before the pandemic. And the concern is that that may actually be escalating. And there was a recent nice National Institute of Mental Health director's blog specifically talking about Black youth suicide rates, which have been even more disparately increased. And so trying to get our handle on that kind of extreme self-injury, but I think also substance use disorders or just substance use appears to be on the increase. A lot of anxiety throughout youth and family systems. And then more recently, I think increases in depression, which of course is probably also the risk factor for suicide. So I think worrying about maladaptive coping, and I think it's important to also be thinking about how are we supporting parents through this. So we've talked a lot about how we're trying to support our staff, many of whom, by the way, are also parents, but also how are we supporting parents, because particularly for our youngest children, but not just, children look to their parents to know how worried should they be, how concerned should they be. And as challenging as it was to close schools and work and shift to remote learning, in some ways, I think it's even more challenging to reopen schools and to try to figure out how to do so safely and appropriately and telegraph to our staff that, and to our parents, and then by extension to the students, that these are safe environments to return to. I know way more about HVAC systems than I ever thought I would as a child psychiatrist, and how frequently the air is being recycled, and ensuring that those systems are state of the art, because I live in Massachusetts, the windows are going to stay closed pretty soon. And so that option of being able to just increase the air circulation by opening windows is not going to be be an option for us much longer. And actually our HVAC system is state of the art, and if we open windows, it's going to actually make things worse rather than better. So I think ensuring that we're giving good information about what measures you've specifically taken in a very transparent, non-technological way, I think can go a long way to reducing people's anxiety. Again, you want to give people control over the things that we have control over. And so much control has been taken from us in this pandemic that we really want to figure out these kind of very low-tech creative solutions that I'm hearing and reading light up in the chat box. I think getting outdoors as much as possible, reconnecting with nature, but also reconnecting with the very kinds of natural supports that people have always utilized, and figuring out creative ways to still be able to access them. I think that that's a good remedy for some of the anxiety and depression and just overall stress that we're all experiencing, frankly.
Great, thank you so much, Christopher. And again, many of the concerns that you mentioned, anxiety, including social anxiety, depression, suicidality, social skills concerns, substance use, we're seeing light up in our chat box. And because we want to also focus on solutions and hope building today, we do want to hear about what are our schools doing with this anticipation and increased concerns among our students and families. So Shauna, let me start with you. In light of some of the concerns that we just heard about, how are you working now to prepare schools to respond and to be proactive in both identifying concerns, but also addressing them as they might arise?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think is really beneficial is relying on what we know about good multi-tiered systems of support, and first and foremost, implementing good preventative kinds of activities for all students and families, to provide information and to provide supports and proactively. But then also to have measures in place to help us understand when those primary prevention efforts are not successful and when we need more targeted and intensive supports. And so relying on what we have utilized for so long to address academic and social emotional concerns, I think can also be applied to helping educators respond to kids and to families who have been impacted by the pandemic and by closures. And so I think those good practices can be adapted to this as well. I think as individual educators, we have to be open and willing to adapt our practice. And so I think about my own practice has shifted pretty significantly, both during closures and as we return to a hybrid learning model. And so I have to be able to adjust and pivot to meet the needs of my students. And so those might look differently now for students that are in hybrid or remote instruction than they did when they were in school together. I also think as a school psychologist, one of my primary functions is not only providing direct mental and behavioral health supports, but it's the indirect supports through consultation with parents and families. And I've noticed that I've really had to shift that consultative support to emphasize more how I support families and caregivers, because they are the ones who are on the front lines more so than ever. And so that has been a pretty significant impact that I have seen just in my own practice. So I think that those sorts of things, and one of the things that I want to amplify too is just the need to help support and provide information to parents and educators, because these are not necessarily things that they expected to do. They didn't expect to be facilitating online learning. They didn't expect to be necessarily being frontline workers. And so I think as mental health experts, we can help to prepare them by providing that information, helping to normalize some of their experiences and helping to promote some of those positive coping strategies.
Thanks so much, Shauna. And Tiffany, I'd like to turn a similar question to you in terms of how we can best prepare our educators, but also our mental health professionals as we see these anticipated increases in trauma and anxiety and grief and loss. And I want to specifically call out a comment in the chat box where one of our participants noted not only are our young people, our students of color, experiencing the disparate impacts of COVID, but also the racial trauma that is ongoing, is not new, but is certainly more salient in terms of its coverage right now and the national discussion. And so in light of COVID and in light of the discussion around social injustices and racism, I'm wondering if you could share any thoughts, Tiffany, about how we can best prepare not only our schools, but also our school mental health workforce.
Absolutely. It's so important that our schools and mental health workers really have a good understanding about how these recent events and the recent increased exposure to racial injustice and racial trauma are impacting our young people. And it's so important for both educators and school mental health providers and parents to know that the impact of systemic injustices and social determinants on all children, and especially our Black, Indigenous, people of color, or children of color, who themselves and their families have experienced historical oppression, and that historical oppression results in many of the trauma responses that we see for folks who experience other types of trauma. And as educators and school mental health clinicians, we are being called upon to provide supports for folks experiencing trauma, including racial trauma. And it's so important that when we, especially as mental health clinicians, are working with communities of color, that we are careful not to pathologize their responses to racial trauma, because this can be turning to victim blaming. And really, it's important that we have an understanding of the problem really existing with the system that perpetuates the injustice and results in the difficulties that our children experience. So it's first important for us to have that conceptualization of trauma, and that really incorporates an understanding of the impact of social injustices on people's experiences. And we also need to rethink the way that we are doing trauma treatment, to really, it's important for us to build up student skills and coping skills, problem solving skills, and, effective coping skills and cognitive skills, while at the same time supporting students or being a part of the system, being a part of the change that we want to see in the system, right? We want to build up individual level skills with children and with families, but we also want to be supporting anti-racist policies and speaking out against policies and practices that harm children from communities that have been historically marginalized. And for educators, they are being called in many instances to have conversations with students in the classroom about, what's going on in terms of racial injustice. And I think it's so important that before educators are kind of put in the position to do that level of education with young people, that there is an assessment of their needs in terms of, their comfortability with having conversations and being able to manage a classroom environment that is safe and supportive of all students when they bring up those topics in the classroom environment. And so I think it's so important that it is a prerequisite for being able to have those conversations with students in the classroom and really promote cultural responsiveness and equity in the classroom. It's a prerequisite for educators to have to do some introspection, educators and school mental health clinicians, to do some introspections where they are having a better understanding about their own cultural identities and their own implicit biases and the impact of those on their relationships with students and their instructional practices. And so that they do the work that they need to do to make sure that they're not a part of, that we are not a part of the system that perpetuates injustices in school.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And, many of you in your responses were speaking about the role of educators in being on the front lines and in the homes of many students during distance learning, and certainly even during hybrid or in-person. Our educators are on the front lines of both identifying and often supporting students who are experiencing mental health concerns. We've also seen a number of questions come across about how can we better equip our educators to help identify child abuse and neglect, or help our schools when we know the numbers have been going down during school closure. So I want to ask the audience about what you have seen schools doing successfully to equip educators with the tools they need to identify students who are experiencing mental health concerns and those who may be experiencing abuse and neglect. So if you could enter some of that into the chat box, it would be great. And I want to comment on the thread that I've seen throughout around universal screening. So one of our participants put into the chat that the Trails effort in Michigan have been supporting efforts to conduct universal screening, but there's some pushback or some concern that maybe teachers shouldn't be administering surveys. There are concerns about re-traumatizing students. And so we certainly know that there are a number of questions and concerns that can be raised when we talk about universal mental health screening in schools. At the same time, we know there are many schools that are right now really trying in earnest to identify students who may need extra support. So the question that came through was, can you comment on the pros and cons of universal mental health screening in settings where there may not be adequate school mental health professionals available to lead those efforts. So I'll start with a quick response, and then Shauna, I'm going to turn it over to you. One thing that I think the question illustrates is the need to not rely solely on those within the walls of the school building to support the mental health of students. This really is where school community partnerships can be essential. If you're doing universal screening, it's important that your school partner with the behavioral health partners in the community. So Shauna, I'm curious your thoughts about the pros and cons of doing school mental health universal screening, and maybe some successes you've seen or strategies that you've seen work.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't comment on a specific tool or method. I do think that that's where school teams really need to come together and talk about what information they already have and what additional information they need to serve their student population. I do want to alert the participants to one resource that's available from the National Association of School Psychologists, and this is the COVID-19 School Adjustment Risk Matrix. And it is a relatively non-invasive decision matrix that will help school personnel to identify students that may be more at risk than others. And we consider both their pre-COVID experiences, but also their experiences during quarantine and during school closure. And so I think that those universal screeners can be simple measures that help us to identify kids that may be at more increased risk. And I do think it's incumbent upon us as school leaders to help to identify those resources, both within our schools and through those community partnerships, to help us address those needs. And for school psychologists and other school employed mental health professionals, school counselors, school social workers, I really think it's an opportunity for us to talk about the importance of that mental health role in schools, and certainly the other roles that we play with regard to assessment and academic intervention. Those are important roles too. But I really think this is an opportunity for us to talk about how we can assist in providing those services to our students when we know that they're at increased risk. And so I do think that those screeners can help us to identify just how many students we may need to serve. It gives us information about what kinds of practices we may need to employ. And I really think, as much as we can, we have to find these opportunities that this crisis has created for us. And if that means helping to expand our role into more mental health, if it means reaching out and partnering with our community-based partners, I think that these are opportunities. And so if we're focusing on solutions, I think this is the conversation that we can be having, is what is the solution to the mental health issue? And so I encourage the gathering of data to help us make those informed decisions.
Excellent. Thanks for speaking to the importance of multi-tiered systems of support and school teaming to make the decisions. I see a number of recommended tools coming into the chat box, but as Shauna said, that really is a school team decision process. And there's a lot of discussion that needs to go into selection of tools, but also just how to get the resource capacity in place to conduct the screening and to respond to any screening outputs. Some of our colleagues at the University of Connecticut put out a resource guide on responding to COVID-19, planning for trauma-informed assessment in schools. So I did just share that in the resource link. And there's also a group out of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that is working on this very issue in terms of better using screeners in the context of schools and specifically around trauma and COVID. So thank you for your remarks, Shauna. So we are seeing a number of questions come into our chat box, and I want to try to get to some of those while we can. So one of the comments from Erin was, what are youth and young adults saying, and what are the results of feedback from students? And I want to put that question out to our panelists. I'll comment briefly that I was on a panel over the last couple of weeks where a couple of our students, our high school students, noted that their school had gone to great lengths to set up office hours and to set up kind of a referral pathway process for them. And many of them said, or the two panelists on this group said, we will never use what they have set up for us. And they didn't ask us what it was that we really wanted. Now, these two students specifically said they would have preferred just a check-in from a specified teacher. They wanted the ability to be able to say who it was that they wanted to check in with them, and they wanted an outreach for every student in the school, even a 15-minute check-in. So I think your point, Erin, about what are the students saying is really important here. And I'm wondering, Tiffany, if you've heard from any of your students or in looking at any data from students about what it is that the students are saying right now that they need.
Students are definitely saying that they need a break from the computer. They are, getting zombied out, and they need time to kind of, in between classes, they need time to stretch, to move around, and they're asking for that in some districts, and some, I'm sure there's variations across classrooms where they're able to do that, but they're definitely asking for more. Students are also very engaged when we do have opportunities as school mental health clinicians to go into the classroom and check in with them about how they're feeling and their reactions to the new learning environment, speaking specifically to the distance learning environment. And they are very open to have conversations about how they're feeling and very responsive to wellness activities, like wellness breaks, mindfulness activities, journaling activities. They're very responsive to that, which suggests to me that they see the need for it. And there's really a value for engaging in those exercises to really maintain their own self-care.
Excellent. Thank you, Tiffany. A few more questions coming in here about how community-based mental health providers can work with schools on how to support youth who are at risk when learning virtually. So Christopher, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for all of our community-based mental health providers who may be on today about how they can best partner with schools, and whether it's information that they're providing to schools or how they can provide actual services to schools and students.
Yeah, I think if they haven't already had an established relationship with the school, it's a great time to make themselves available and make those connections. And I think it can come in a number of ways. We've talked about the need for parent support. So creating parent support groups, or, I hesitate to suggest anything more that's going to drive more eyes to computers, but most of the behavioral health, at least in Massachusetts, is being done virtually. So unfortunately, it is the thing that gets us back to our computers. So I think thinking about parent support opportunities, I think thinking about teacher support opportunities, and then thinking about direct services to students. I love doing these kinds of consultations where I get on a call with a bunch of educators and the mental health team from the school, and we just talk about students. We talk about them in kind of the tier one, what are the universal things that we need to be thinking about, both because of COVID, because of what we're seeing around structural racism, and we're seeing in other crisis communities, like we've talked about in fires and earthquakes and hurricane responses. And then also, the loss. One of the things that I think we need to also articulate is that in addition to anxiety, in addition to depression, in addition to trauma, we also have over 200,000 deaths in this country. And we have many millions of people, over 6 million at last count, who have been infected with this virus. So real fears, and also disrupted grieving processes. So how many of those 200,000 hadn't had a proper funeral? How many people have not been appropriately grieved, and how disruptive that is to the grieving process. And so these uncomplicated grief reactions that can become more depressive disorders. So thinking about how do you partner in providing resources and supports to the schools, because the schools can't handle all of this on their own. And I think community health centers actually can learn from all of you folks about the MTSS model, because they have services and supports to help you think about what's the appropriate screening instrument for the specific issues relevant for your community. Because each community is a little different in terms of how this COVID virus has impacted them. How can you be thinking about screening and then providing services for the tier 2 kiddos, and then perhaps providing direct services for those tier 3 kiddos using the MTSS model. So I think finding opportunities to partner would be really critically important. And I just want to say one other thing, not directly related to the question you asked me, Sharon, but Judge Baker also provides the Child at Risk hotline for the state of Massachusetts after hours and weekends. So we partner with our child welfare agency, the Department of Children and Families. And I posted a tip sheet that I can post again that the Commonwealth put together specifically for educators to be thinking about what to look for. And I want to be careful about this, because we don't want to be calling child welfare on families who are not able to access remote learning. That would be adding further injury to so many challenged families. But we do want to create inquiry. And so some of the suggestions that they have offered or suggested educators think about is just, routine check-ins. So asking questions like, how are you feeling today? Or how was your night? Or how can I help you today? And if you're one of the school-based behavioral health support team providers who may be doing some telehealth of your own from the school platform, I always think it's a good idea to come up with like a safe word, so that if the child is not feeling safe, there's a way that they can communicate that, because many of their communications are being monitored by people in the house. I also suggest that the students wear headphones so that you're able to talk with them, and people in the area may not be able to hear some of those more private conversations. Asking the student to take you on a virtual tour of their home. There's incredible opportunity that we have to see into children's lives in a way that we didn't before. And while doing that respectfully and appropriately, we can sometimes find out a lot more about families than we may have realized, both in the ways that they may be struggling, but in also the ways that they may be really creative and resilient, that we can take those lessons to other work that we're doing. Providing reassurance and validation. So acknowledge that this is a new way of learning and it feels different. Sending positive notes through remote learning sites or through the mail even. Complimenting your students on the work they've completed. Ensuring that they've got access to wellness. A lot of the suggestions that we've already had. And then, if you do find that families are struggling, finding alternative ways of responding to that. In many states, you have a 211 number, or there's a way to access family resources and family support specialists, and thinking about this workforce that can be so critically helpful. I saw Millie Sweeney from the FREDLA organization, Family Run Executive Director Leadership Association, or the Federation for Families with Children of Special Needs in Massachusetts. We have the Parent Professional Advocacy League. Most states have one of these family-run organizations that can be incredible resources in matching families with services. So obviously, we are all mandated reporters. If there is clear abuse or neglect, then we want to intervene and we want to make sure those children are getting those services. Calls to our hotline are down by about 25% at this point. At one point, they were as low as 50%. And that's happening throughout, because many of the schools, all of you, are some of the primary reporters of abuse or neglect. So while it's important to remain vigilant and be looking for signs of unsafe home environments or direct abuse or neglect, I think it's also incredibly important to be thoughtful about getting those resources into our most in need families, and not blaming them for their inability to respond to the challenges of this pandemic.
Thank you, Christopher. And again, while you were speaking, even many additional creative ideas about ensuring that we're reaching families. We were reminded that not all families have access to internet. I love your idea about sending something through the mail. Sometimes we forget that's an option, but it can let families know that you're there and you're thinking of them, and maybe additional pathways to reach you. A number of folks in the chat box indicated that they are doing socially distanced in-home visits when invited or given permission from families. So we want to keep in mind there are many ways that we can partner with our students and families, even during school closures or hybrid learning models. I don't want to leave today before addressing a concern that's come out from a number of folks. And Shauna, I'm going to ask this question of you. We know that a number of students who are having to engage in distance learning right now may be struggling with behavioral health challenges that are impacting them and their families, and even the virtual classrooms. Many students are receiving behavioral health support through special education services like 504 plans and IEPs. And so one of the most common questions that we are getting as a national center is, how can we ensure as families that we are getting the supports we need for our students, that the accommodations are implemented in a way that's supportive for our students. So I wonder if you could speak to that, Shauna, and how we can best support families and students.
I think that's a great question. I was watching some of the comments go by, and I think it was Susan who mentioned that there hadn't been any mention of support for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities as well. And I think that that was an incredibly important point, not just how we serve and meet the needs of our students with disabilities, but also considering those students who have the most low incidence disabilities, because I think that at least anecdotally, it seems like this pandemic and the school closures have been especially impactful for those families and for those students. And I think we'd be remiss not to talk about that a little bit. I think to the greatest extent that we can continue to partner with those families to help understand what their experience is like and what the needs of their children are during this learning model, whatever model they're accessing. I think that that's incredibly important, because so students have individual needs anyway, and we're in the midst of a completely unprecedented way of adapting instruction to a global pandemic. And I think that partnering with families becomes incredibly important. And the beautiful thing about an IEP is that it's supposed to be individualized. And I think, again, if there's any opportunity here, it is an opportunity to really reflect on our practices and to what extent we really do individualize the services and how we respond to kids who are in need. And I think that that is certainly something that as educators we can take on and embrace, and recognize that it's a challenge, and accept that it's a challenge that we need to try to meet to the best extent possible. And I feel like my communication to families is, I hope we're coming to the table with the goal, and that is helping kids. And I have just had to put so much of my energy into just really trying to understand what that experience is like, both for the child and for the parent and for the staff members that are supporting them, to use my best problem solving and consultative skills to support them.
Thanks so much, Shauna. And I know that some of our national colleagues at the National Association of State Directors of Special Education have put out guidance to families and to educators about how to adjust accommodations in the context of distance learning. So some of those resources may be helpful as well. We saw a great thread of comments here about peer support, and Christopher shared a resource from Youth Move National about student peer support. So just want to highlight that and call that out as one mechanism that more and more districts are leveraging, is the expertise and support of student members of their school to support the mental health and well-being of students. So thank you for bringing that up as a topic. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask each of our panelists in 1 minute or less just to leave us with a few thoughts about how we can instill hope, optimism, readiness as our schools are restarting. So I'll ask Christopher to start us off.
I just posted one of the favorite mantras that I learned from one of these chats from a participant was, we're all trying to do our pandemic best. And what I love about that is it gives us space to get it wrong. It gives us space to be ourselves. I saw some comments about, just being transparent of the fact that we are all in this together. And that actually could be something that's really positive because there's a lot of things that we're not in agreement with each other in this country. And so if we can come together in our shared response to COVID, even if we have different perceptions of risk or different ways of responding, I think that that would be an incredibly powerful movement. And so forgiving each other for when we get it wrong, for supporting each other when we need help, for knowing there is no script for how to do this just right. And so we're going to do our best, and we're going to do our pandemic best.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I like that phrase. I'll be using it from now moving forward. Tiffany, could you share under a minute?
Yeah, I just encourage in the spirit of doing our pandemic best and knowing that we are all in this together, I encourage everyone from students to parents to educators and other supporting families and children to really rely on relationships and to, utilize and tap into all of your social support networks to get the support that you need, and especially to educators and school mental health clinicians and parents who are responsible for supporting children. It's so important that we do everything that we can to fill our own bucket so that we can sustain and support our youth.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And Shauna?
I just go back to where is the opportunity, because I think it is so easy to get mired down in the challenges and the barriers. And I think it's just really important for us to look for opportunity. And as somebody who has spent their life in a public school setting in one way or another, and then has chosen now to work in one, I am such a strong supporter of public education and what it can do to close the achievement gap, to remove barriers. And I just really think we have an opportunity to really reflect on, are we meeting those goals of providing the best that we can to all students. And I think that there's some opportunities here for us to reflect on our practices, on our historical practices, and to really make some changes for the better in terms of how we serve all students. And so I think that's for me every day when I walk into my building. I'm looking for the opportunities to do better and to do my pandemic best, I think, because there are some days that it feels like I'm struggling to do that. But I'm just looking for the opportunity and trying to communicate that hope to the people that I work with.
Thank you, Christopher and Tiffany and Shauna, for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. Thank you, Morgan and Melanie, for interpretation today with us. And thank you to all of our participants who were very active in today's discussion. We will be sending the resources shared in the chat and the recording of our discussion to everyone who registered. Your contributions do truly demonstrate that together we're stronger in creating forward-looking solutions to meet the challenges of today while building a brighter tomorrow. Thank you again. Please try to take time to care for yourselves while taking care of your families. And you will see an evaluation pop up into the screen or in the chat box as we are departing today. So please take the time. We look forward to hearing your thoughts.